I will. And again, if you do have questions that come up, if you submitted a question, they should be addressed during the presentation. If questions or comments come up, you can type them into the chat, and as time allows for the presentation, we'll try to keep this to about an hour. We'll try to address those at the conclusion of the talk. Oops.
Okay, ready? Okay. All right, so thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to just dive right in. Proper pruning techniques. So people ask, why should you prune? So there's a couple of reasons why you prune. One is for safety. If you had dead limbs can obviously fall off and hit somebody, so you'd want to prune those. Larger ones are best left to a professional pruning service. Also, you want to prune for the tree's health. If a particular branch union is more like a V, you wind up with a lot of included bark, and that means the bark is in between the two branches of the tree, and what that does is it acts as a wedge, and eventually it will force that branch to fall off. You'll notice a lot of that happening on calorie pear trees, those white flowering trees that you see a couple weeks ago. Also, you want to take out overgrown plant material, or if you want to remove rot, fungus, and damage. You also prune for aesthetics. So if you want the tree to be a certain shape or certain size, or the shrub, that's why you would do that. When should you prune? So when I was in college, I had a college professor who said you prune when the shears are sharp, meaning that you could really prune anytime. It's not really, the plant doesn't really care whether, what time of the year it gets pruned, but there are considerations when you prune to make sure that you can maximize your flowering for your various shrubs. So there's spring flowering versus summer flowering. So spring flowering plants in general, they will flower on old wood. That means that they're flowering on the wood that they grew the year before. So if you prune your plant in the early spring, you will not have flowers. Like, for example, azaleas. If you prune your azalea in the spring before they flower, you're going to have nothing. Or if you have deer that nibble on your azaleas, they usually nibble the ends of the branches, and they will also, nibble off your buds. So that's another way that you will not have a spring flowering flower. Summer flowering plants flower on new wood, so you can prune them in the spring, and when they grow, they will also produce flower heads. One exception, hydrangea. There were a couple questions about hydrangeas. Hydrangeas generally flower on old wood. There are a few varieties that flower on new wood, but for the most part, a lot of your older hydrangeas, if you have a very old plant, those flower on old wood. So again, if you have deer, hydrangea is a particular favorite, so they will generally eat your buds off of the hydrangea. Also, certain plants, if they're pruned in the spring, the sap tends to run a lot, and that would be maples and birch trees. So you can prune it, but you will have a weeping cut end that is going to drip for a while, for probably a few days. The sap will come out after it's pruned if you do it in the spring. Other pruning considerations. So most conifers and some hollies, they have a strong central leader. That means it's the center, the centermost part of the plant. And it likes to just grow from that central leader. If you cut that central leader, what it's going to do, it's going to send out several co-dominant leaders. And what you'll wind up having is a very top-heavy conifer. And, conifers generally, the term conifer means like cone. They generally grow in a triangular shape, smaller at the top and wider at the bottom. When you cut that central leader, it's going to send out these co-dominant leaders, and then you're going to have this weird, top-heavy conifer. So if you do want to do that. So for an American holly, white pine, Norway spruce, any kind of your typical needle-leaved conifers, you want to cut out any of those find the straightest, strongest one and cut all the other ones out that are growing straight up. Also, you should remove water sprouts. Water sprouts are those branches that pop up at the base of the tree with lots of leaves on them. What water sprouts tend to do is they tend to affect the health of the tree, and they will sort of hijack a lot of the nutrients that are supposed to go up to the top of the tree by going into these water sprouts. So it's best to cut out any water sprouts that would pop up. So you have to use the correct tools. So the first thing on the list is a pruning saw, and I have a couple of examples. You'll notice that the shape of a pruning saw is generally long and narrow and curved like this, so you can get into between branches, between the branch and the trunk of the tree. There are other types similar to this. There's other ones that have like a switchblade effect where they fold in on themselves. This is another pruning saw. And one of the things you notice on the pruning saw, that the blade is very narrow to get into tight spaces. They're also very, very sharp. Just keep that in mind. And this is actually a root pruning saw, sorry. Bypass shears is something like this. This one is not a Felco, but it is very similar to a Felco. Everybody's heard of the Felco brand probably, but they call it a bypass because the blade bypasses the stationary part of the pruner and slices it off. This is a very good type of pruner for general pruning, if you can find one like this. There's also, this is called an anvil pruner. I'm not as wild about these. They call it an anvil pruner because basically the blade stops on a flat surface. What this sometimes can do is it can crush the end of the branch that you're cutting, so you may not, this doesn't really give you a great cut, but there are certain types of plants that are very stringy, like elm trees, and if you're cutting small branches off an elm tree, sometimes if you use the bypass pruner, it won't really cut all the way through, so you might be better off like holding it with this and then pulling the piece off. Next thing on the list is loppers. There's actually an illustration of a lopper on there, but you know, it has long handles for leverage. I picked up these at a garage sale, one of my neighbors. It's a really nice, good quality tool. That's a great place to find good yard tools too, is yard sales, garage sales, because when people are moving into apartments and things, they don't need them, and you can get some great stuff that's, you know, good quality. Also, you have to wear gloves, eye protection, and probably the most important thing is disinfectant. I just keep a little spray bottle of rubbing alcohol. When you go from one plant to another, whatever your tool that you're using, you prune one plant. Don't go from plant to plant to plant. Go to one plant first, do all your pruning on that plant, and then you take your spray bottle of rubbing alcohol and spray down the blade on the tool before you go to the next, oops, I don't know what happened there. Before you go to the next plant, because you don't want to, if your plant has any kind of a disease, if you don't sterilize the tools, you're going to spread that disease from one plant to another. So, you know, you can even use an old Windex container and fill it, just mark it rubbing alcohol, just put a little label on it, and that will work just fine. So the main point of this presentation is to prune properly. So it may be hard to see from this photograph here, but this is an example of a poorly done cut. And what the person who cut this branch off did was, and there's another picture of this in the next slide, they cut it at an angle, so the bark is going to have a very hard time growing on the left side because the stub is out too far. You can see it better in this next picture, where on the picture on the left, you can see where it should have been cut is sort of right where the bark is growing. And if you look at the picture on the right, the bark is having a very hard time growing over that cut end. And it will probably eventually cover over that spot because trees are very resilient, but it will take a very, very long time, and you're going to leave that cut end of the tree open for longer than it should be, and that can introduce insects and diseases. So you want the plant to be able to heal as quickly as possible, and by doing a proper pruning cut, you will allow the plant to do that. So the proper way to prune is 3 steps. The first step would be to make a small cut on the bottom of the branch, and this prevents bark ripping. So think about if you were just cutting a branch and you let that branch fall, when the weight of the branch, when you get about halfway or 2/3 through the branch, the weight of that branch is going to make the branch break off. And when it does, that bark is going to rip all the way down the trunk. So now you're creating a tougher situation for the tree to come back from, because it's going to have to not only heal that branch where it was cut, but all the way down the bark where the bark ripped. So you don't want to do that. Then the first cut, again, is just a little bit under the branch where you're cutting. Then go 8 to 12 inches further out beyond the undercut and cut that one all the way through. As you're cutting that branch, the weight of the branch is going to make it fall off. And as the bark rips, it's going to get to your first cut and it's going to fall to the ground without damaging the tree. Then the final cut would be just outside the branch collar, and don't cut it too flush or leave a stub. That first slide was stubs, and I have some examples to show. So this illustration, courtesy of Hickory Hollow Landscapers, shows you the ABC. So first cut is A, the second cut is B, and the third cut is C. And in this particular case, it looks like in this illustration, you can see the C is the angle of the cut that you're going to try to make. And especially when the branch is dead, as it probably is on the left side of the illustration, the tree will kind of show you where to cut, because the bark and the branch collar is going to be a little bit fatter than the branch itself, and that's going to be the spot to cut. Here's another better example. One of the things that you'll also notice is that depending on the size of the limb, if you're using the bypass shears like the photograph on the left, I wouldn't do a branch more than a 1/2 inch with bypass shears, because otherwise it's going to be too hard to cut anything larger than a 1/2 inch with this. Anything that's between a 1/2 inch and almost an inch, you can use these loppers. And anything bigger than an inch, you'd be better off using the pruning saw, because you want to do something that you can do with your the tool at hand. This is an illustration of a tree that I myself pruned on my street, and you can see how on the picture on the left it's healing very nicely. It's almost completely healed, but this branch was probably only about an inch around when I cut it off. And if you look at the picture on the right, you see how the branch, the bark is already starting to cover over the cut portion. These are 2 other cuts on that same tree. The one on the right was a smaller branch, and you can see that one is already completely sealed. The ones on the left are very close to being completely sealed, and really that's the key. You want to cut the branch correctly so the tree can heal over it as quickly as possible. And you don't really need to put that black stuff on the cut ends. The tree knows how to compartmentalize itself and cut things off. So now for shrub, now we're going to talk a little bit about shrub pruning. You can throw away your shears and use hand pruners, especially these. If you want to cut out the old large canes to rejuvenate an old plant, such as a lilac, you can do that. That's one of the things. If you have a very overgrown lilac that's kind of getting too big for its space, and it has these, it might have a lot of dead branches in it, and it might have some really big, like 2-inch diameter or 1.5-inch diameter branches. You can cut those out. all the, to about a foot from the ground. And what the plant will do is the plant will send out new shoots, and it will actually reinvigorate the plant. You'll have better foliage, better flowering. Talking about health, you want to, when you're looking at either trees or shrubs, small trees, for the health of the tree, you want to remove any crossing or rubbing branches, because as the branch, when the wind blows and the branches rub together, you're going to leave like an open wound on the tree. And again, the open wound will give you areas where insects and disease can infiltrate the plant. So you want to try to avoid that. I will also say that a lot of the things that you're going to be, hearing in this presentation are not going to be things that you see out in the real world. The reason for that is you can't always assume that your average landscaper knows the correct way to prune. And a lot of the things that you see being done, such as cone mulching, where you put a giant mound of mulch on top of the tree and cutting the shrub like a V shape, these are all wrong. The reason why the shrub should be left wider at the bottom is that if you cut the shrub in a V shape like this, what you're doing is you're shading out the bottom part of the shrub. So the top is wider, the bottom is narrower. You're not letting any sun get to the bottom part of that shrub. And that's how you wind up with a leggy, unattractive shrub, because it's not getting any sun down to the bottom. Also, one of the common things when you go to a nursery or a garden center or Home Depot, Lowe's to buy any type of a plant, pretty much everything today is in a container. It's just the way the market is. Very few things are balled and burlapped anymore, or they're bare, very rarely bare root. But you really have to look at the plant. When you take that plant out of the pot before you put it in the ground, you should root prune it, meaning you should cut all of those circling roots that are on the root ball, or the part that was in the container. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is those roots are generally going to continue to grow around in a circle, and they will, as the plant gets older, it will strangle itself and die. So you're not going to hurt the plant by cutting those circling roots. And what I tend to do when I take a plant out of a container is I always have a razor blade. I take the plant out of the container and I put a lot of vertical cuts around the entire root ball, and I cut all the roots on the outside vertically. And by doing that, you've solved two problems. You're going to remove the girdling roots, and you're also going to create areas where the roots will send out new shoots where they've been cut. This is an illustration of proper branch pruning, courtesy of This Old House. They had a nice drawing. The top left is your good cut. It's about a 45-degree angle just above the bud. You can all read, I'm sure, so you can see what the too angular, too high, too low. So just ignore the other three and look at the top left. That is the proper way to prune if you're pruning a shrub. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the shrub rejuvenation, like we were talking about the lilacs. So if you look at A, B, and C, you want to take out, maybe not all of the big branches, but you want to take out some of the really large old branches. And when you do that, you can see the green new growth coming up. Because if you cut too much of the plant off the first year, it could die, because it has a large root system, and it's depending on all of those existing leaves to feed the roots on that root system. So you don't want to cut everything the first year. Then the second year, you thin it some more, and you get the two really big ones in the center, and it's going to send out more new growth. And then by the third year, you cut the rest of the old parts of the plant out, and then you'll have a brand new shrub coming off the same rootstock. Now, shearing, I think I meant to mention that I didn't, if you'll notice when I was showing you all the tools at the beginning of the program, I didn't show any head shears. I say throw them away. The reason why, unless you're doing a formal clipped hedge and you want to have that look, I would say throw away the head shears, because what that does, if this is the plant, everywhere, if you shear this plant, everywhere you cut it, it's going to send out a little witch's broom of new growth. And you're going to have all this very intense growth on the end and nothing on the inside. I tend to leave my shrubs in a more natural form. I use generally these bypass pruners. I cut off the branches that are kind of a little too far gone out of the general shape. I'll cut it in a few places, and the benefit of that is it's a more natural looking, it takes less maintenance to maintain, and it just looks better, and it's better for the plant. The other thing is, if you, I don't know if you do your work yourself or if you have a lawn service do it, and you'll notice a lot of lawn services or, you know, landscapers, they come and they shear everything into little meatballs, little squares. That's a very labor intensive way of doing things. And what it does is it keeps them in work, because every time they cut it, it's going to grow more, and then they have to come back and cut it more. So they're going to charge you more to keep cutting your shrubs. So just keep that in mind. Here's another example of why you shouldn't shear, because you know, you don't want to have that witch's broom with all the branches at the very end and not much at the bottom. So here's an example of a poorly trimmed yew. As you can see, it's sort of flat on the top and, you know, lower at the bottom. Here's another one, and see, this is what happens. You prune like this, and there are no leaves on the inside of this shrub, because they've been shearing it and shearing it and shearing it, and it's so dense on the outside and nothing can get into the center. See? So you wind up with just a little bit of stuff on the outside and nothing on the center. I have a yew similar to this in my yard, and it has needles all the way to the center of the plant, but it also has a more natural form. I'm sorry, I don't know. Oh, there it is. So that's my yew. Granted, it's not next to a building. That's also another consideration that you need to think of, is not to plant things too close to buildings or structures or other things, because they do grow in a concentric circle fashion. So if you plant something too close to a walkway or a building, a house, it will eventually overgrow that space. So there's there were a couple of questions that's sort of the end of the presentation, but people did write in some questions. So the best time and best way to prune forsythia. The best time to prune forsythia would be now, which is, you know, after it flowers, because you want to make sure you have flowers for next year. But as a landscape architect, I find that a forsythia is a poor choice to have in a very high traffic area, because they are extremely fast growing and they're very, very hard to control. And you're going to have to prune it a lot because of the nature of the plant, the forsythia plant. In my opinion, the best place for a forsythia is towards the back of your yard, and you could let it grow and become a thicket. And the way the forsythia tends to grow into a thicket is that the branches arch over. When they do the complete arch all the way around, when the end of that branch touches the ground next to it, it will root and start a new plant, and then it will grow again. And that's how it will spread. But the nice thing about that is that you can leave it alone. You'll never have to prune it, and you have a nice mass of yellow in the spring. Oh, any other questions? Oh, there's another. Two slides mixed up. Somebody asked, can Alberta spruce be pruned? What's the best way and time? They want to be 3 feet tall, and I want to keep them from getting too big. Yes, you can. Well, Alberta spruce is a cultivar of a regular spruce, and it has a strange, you know, it was a sport, I guess, when they first found the Alberta spruce. It was a sport, which is a mutation in the plant with those small needles, and they tend to grow into these little nose cones. The only way to keep it in that shape is to prune it in that shape, and you will probably, you are better off probably using these to keep it in shape. and try to make sure that it's not sheared, but try to keep it a little natural, but in that general pyramidal shape. Somebody wanted to know, how do they prune these plants? This is an arborvitae. There's many types of arborvitae. This is the globe arborvitae. They tend to not get much taller than 3 feet, and they maybe get 4 feet in diameter. Again, I would not prune with shears, because you're going to create a lot of work for yourself, and you're also going to wind up with a plant with nothing on the inside. But I would also take your bypass pruners, and I would go around and I would take off the ones that are sort of like, give it a haircut, take out the hair that's a little bit too long somewhere, and just generally cut off the ones that are too long. But I wouldn't cut every single part of it. Unless you really need to reduce the size of it, then you'd have to really go deep into the plant and cut deeper down. A green giant is another type of arborvitae. That's the tall one. I think generally arborvitaes do not have a naturalistic form. They have more of a, almost like a more formal type of look. And I would say that if you're going to use shears, you could probably use it on your green giant, because it's probably in an area that's close to either a patio or something, or you have it in a narrow area, and you can use the shears with a larger arborvitae. But bear in mind that arborvitaes like full sun. If you have any shade, and if you plant a row of arborvitaes in an area where there's some shade, you will see that the size definitely will go down where they're shaded out, and they will never be the same size, which is always odd, because you want all the arborvitaes to be the same height. How do you know what's a weed and what's not? Well, the true definition of a weed is that any plant can be a weed if it's where you don't want it to be. With that being said, generally, you kind of have to get to know what the weeds are. There are some newer ones that I've come across these last couple of years that I don't remember from 10 or 15 years ago. One of them is bittercress. That's the one that comes out very early in the season. It has little white flowers, and it has these little spikes with seeds on them. If you touch them, it opens up and they shoot them all over the place. But they tend to disappear. Like right about now, you won't see the bittercress anymore. They have a very short life cycle. There's dandelions, there's duckweed, there's chickweed, there's ground ivy. So I would say, if just a great way to figure out, if you don't know what it is, you could send something to your cooperative extension, or you can go on to Google and just type in weed with purple flower, and then it'll give you some images, and you can pick the one that it is. That's probably your best way to figure that out. One of my strategies for weeds, especially dandelions, I don't like to use a lot of herbicides on my lawn, but I wait till they flower. I go around with my Weed B Gone in a small hand sprayer. I will pick the yellow flower heads off so they don't go to seed, and I will spray that individual dandelion, and it kills just that dandelion. It only puts the herbicide in that one spot on the lawn, and it keeps other dandelions. Because I'm taking off the seed heads, it prevents them from spreading. In fact, that is the best advice about preventing weeds and spreading weeds, is that if you can control them before they go to seed and throw them away, not composting them in your yard, because those seeds will not be killed through the composting process. And when you use that compost, it'll transfer those weeds wherever you use the compost. So if the weeds are, they're putting out seeds, you want to eliminate those and throw them in your garbage and not compost. How are we doing on time? Good. Almost? Okay. How do you prune an apple tree? Will too much pruning kill my apple tree? I will told if I cut all branches lower than 4 feet, I can keep all the squirrels from eating my apples. Okay. The squirrels that I know are going to get your apples. Having the trees 4 feet up, the branches 4 feet up, I don't think will help, because they'll just climb up the trunk of the tree. Squirrels are very resourceful. As far as pruning your apple tree, I would say at the beginning of the program, when you looked at the tree pruning, that is the best way to prune. I would say in the case of an apple tree, you don't want to leave the branches too thin, because the apples are very heavy. So if you have some large branches, you would want to probably leave some of those. Also, when cutting back a branch, if you don't want to take the branch all the way back to the trunk, you only want to remove it to the next branch that is 2/3 of the branch you're cutting. Because if you cut off a branch and leave too big of a stub, you're going to get a lot of water sprouts coming out of that stub. So try not to do that. I need help pruning rose bushes. Do you know what's happening with the leaves? It's hard for me to tell what's happening to the leaves through this picture. It looks like some of those leaves are new. If some of those leaves are getting black spots on them and turning yellow and falling off, that is a fungus called black spot. Roses are one of the most susceptible. Oh, there's also a fungus called rose rosette, which is what this might be. I'm not 100% sure. If it's rose rosette, you're going to have to take the rose bush out. That's probably a job for the cooperative extension. As far as
apparently it is holes in the leaves.
Holes in the leaves. It could be shot hole fungus, because that's another fungus that generally comes from the mulch if you have too much mulch. I'm going to go back what I said about the cone mulching, which is bad, but you don't really want to have more than 3 or 4 inches of mulch. If you have more than that, it's too much. But anyway, roses get a lot of diseases. It's generally from the leaves getting wet and spreading the fungus. You can spray it with a copper sulfate fungal spray. Try when you water it not to water the leaves, just water the base of the plant. I mean, I realize it rains and it gets wet if it rains, but that you can't control. And the last thing to remember is that any of the leaves that fall in the soil below the plant, you should remove all the diseased leaves that fall to the ground and throw them in the garbage and get them off your property, because the disease will live on through those leaves, and wherever you use that soil or that mulch, it's going to spread it around. Is there another question? Oh, the pruning. So generally, roses I would prune for shape, but one of the best things to do is in the fall, prune all the canes down to about 1 foot from the ground, 1 to 2 feet from the ground, and just prune it all back. And you will notice that by this time the next year, you will have all new shoots coming out, either from the base of the plant or even out of the existing stumps. And you could almost even cut the roses all the way down to the ground, and they will always come back very strong in the spring. Should you prune low bush native Jersey blueberries at all? You can, you don't have to. I would just let them go, and it depends on where you have them. I'm trying to establish them all the way in the back of my yard to have a native understory. It's not really working because the deer are eating them too, but I would say if you have deer, the deer are probably pruning them for you. Proper way and time to prune flowering quince. Again, it's a spring flowering shrub, so the best time to prune it would be now that it's done flowering. I think they've already flowered. They're just about done. And if there's any crossing branches, if there's any dead branches or any super large branches you want to rejuvenate it, cut those out. Best time to prune rhododendron and azalea. The best time to do that is in a couple of weeks. Once they're done flowering, that will be the best time to prune them. I'm also going to touch on If you have one that's way too big, a strategy that I've employed with good success is to go to the back of the plant that's facing the house, prune it really aggressively, down very much, remove a lot of the large branches, leave a little bit there, wait a year for the back of the plant to regenerate, and then prune the front. So the benefit of that is you won't have your neighbors driving by and looking at sticks, because you're going to let the back of it fill in. So when you prune the front, you're still going to have that new growth in the back and it'll look fine. The right time to prune lilacs. Again, they're flowering now. So the best time to prune them would be as soon as they're done flowering. And earlier in the program, I talked about the rejuvenation. You could do that to rejuvenate your lilac, and believe me, it'll come back really well. Somebody has rhodies in pots outside. Should I be pruning them? When? They've been in pots for a year. Pots are very high maintenance. First of all, remember that. You don't have to prune them, but what is going to happen is that you're going to get these roots in these pots are going to just circle around and around. And this is the type of plant that probably shouldn't be in a pot. Generally, pots are for things that cannot overwinter, that you'd have to bring inside if it's something that's woody, or for annuals like your thriller, your filler, your spiller. If it's anything that can grow in the outdoors, it's probably better off being planted in the ground. And also remember to water. How do you prune crepe myrtle? There's a couple things you can do. Crape myrtle used to be marginally hardy in our area, but with global warming, it's getting a little warmer here in New Jersey. In years past, the cold temperatures would kill the crape myrtle down to the ground. But one thing you probably will notice is that the roots of the crape myrtle tend to stay alive, even if the part above the soil dies. So you can cut the crape myrtle all the way to the ground and it will send up new shoots every year. What I like my crape myrtles to be larger, so I go in the spring and I wait for it to start putting its leaves out, which is right about now. You're going to see little red leaves coming out, and I cut it just above the live part. So you'll see where the dead part of the branch is. It's usually very dry and crispy, and you'll see the little leaves coming out. So just cut it right above where you see the life, and that will, at least it would let you have a larger crape myrtle. Crape myrtles can be classified as a shrub or a small tree, because if you get a good one and it gets a thick enough branch and it gets big enough, it could be as big as a small tree like a dogwood. Azalea bush with some dead spots. It's not from over pruning. Azaleas tend to be very brittle. So if you step on it or walk into it the wrong way, or if you have deer running into them or whatever, or if you hit it with the mower, the branches could break and they could die. They also can get other types of diseases. So like I said, use your rubbing alcohol, spray your pruning implement, and prune out all the dead branches, and it should come back for the most part. My lilac always has leaves look sort of shriveled after it blooms. That looks like a pest of some sort. I don't know which one. I'm sorry. I don't know everything. And the thing is, it goes back to one of the things I said earlier, was that you have to think ahead about how big the plant's going to get. You want to think about a mature size. So any plant that you buy, it'll have a little tag usually, and it'll say the size and what it is at maturity. If it's something that's going to be 5 feet around in maturity, you want to make sure it's at least 4 feet from your house, because it's going to grow 2.5 feet in each direction from the center of that plant. And you don't want it to be right up against your siding. And like I said, the biggest mistake that I see it every day of my life is people putting in these cute little plants, and they put this cute little plant 6 inches from their foundation, or they put it 6 inches from their walkway. And what happens in 3 years is that the walkway is now gone because the two, shrubs on either side have closed it off. Any new questions? Or
yeah, we do have quite a few good questions, so we still have some time. So,
do we have time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can
only 45 minutes.
Say anything about grapevines?
Oh, grapevines. Somebody has a question about grapevines. I'm not an expert on grapevines. I know they can be very invasive if they're where you don't want them to be, and they're very hard to eradicate. But for the most part, if you want to have grapevines, it's going to need some sort of support. I think wooden supports are probably okay. I know certain types of wisteria can actually be very heavy, and they need metal supports because they will get heavy enough that they'll just break a wood support. But the grapevines are not going to get that heavy. If there's a specific question about the grapevines, I could try to answer it, but I don't really know a ton about grapes. Anything else?
Right, yeah. I'm just going to read this. My fat Albert tree is spreading more than promised, but if I cut the bottom branch back a foot, will they ever look like the Christmas tree shape again?
The fat Albert is a cultivar that I'm not familiar with. So I would say if you can type in and say, is it a holly?
It's a type of Christmas tree. I don't know. All right.
Well, is it a spruce? Is it a holly? Is it a?
Okay. He says he thinks it's a spruce.
A spruce. Okay. Fat Albert might be a cultivar that's designed to grow in like a round shape, but yeah, you can prune anything into a pyramidal shape. But again, like I said, try not to cut that central leader. That's the one in the center. And then work on creating the pyramidal shape on the rest of the plant, but don't cut the center part. What's the next one?
Gooseberries?
Gooseberry. I'm not really familiar with gooseberry, so I'm not the world's best landscape architect. Sorry.
We covered rose bushes. So I think we covered rhododendrons, right?
Rhododendrons, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Very new question. My dogwoods are getting old. Can I do anything to rejuvenate them?
Yeah, the question is, can you do something about rejuvenating a dogwood? It depends on what kind of dogwood it is. There are several types that you will see out in the landscape these days. There is a Kusa dogwood, which is a Chinese variety, I believe. And then there's the Cornus Florida, which is the native variety. The problem is that the native variety gets a fungus called anthracnose. It's also on some of the maples, the Norway maples, and some of the other maples. And if your dogwood is one of the older standard native varieties, it's probably succumbing to the anthracnose. You can have it treated, by a reputable tree service. They do various treatments, but in general, dogwoods don't really like to be pruned. It takes them a very, very long time to heal. So I wouldn't prune anything really big on a dogwood. I wouldn't prune anything, bigger than an inch around on a dogwood, because it'll be open for a very long time, and then you're going to get pests in there. So only take out the dead stuff that's about an inch in diameter or less, or call like a professional tree service to do some serious pruning if you have to get some big things done. But I would try to leave it alone. Magnolias as well. Magnolias do not take well to pruning at all. So try not to have to prune them.
Not exactly a pruning question, but can you suggest a deer deterrent?
Deer deterrent. There's lots of things I've tried.
It's true.
It's true. I tried tying bars of Irish Spring soap. That worked a little bit. I tried setting up a sprinkler that had a sensor that would turn on when they came by. That didn't work. But the thing that has worked for me is the commercial deer and rabbit repellent spray. You can buy it at your garden center or one of your local home centers. It doesn't smell great to us either. It has a very off smell, but it has worked. And we've been in this house for 7 years, and the first couple of years we didn't have any deer, and then I put in a bunch of lovely, tasty, deer-loving, things that deer love, because I didn't think we had deer. And then the deer came, and my ewe, which that picture was actually when it looked better because the deer have eaten a lot of it. But last year I started spraying with this commercial deer and rabbit repellent that I bought at the big box store. And I will say that it has worked. You do have to reapply frequently enough. If it rains a lot, you have to go back out and spray it again. But I actually have hydrangeas now, and my ewe is not denuded from the deer. So I've been very happy with that. There are also services that you can employ. There are companies that their whole reason for being is just to spray for deer. And you can get one of those, but it's probably a little bit more costly to have it done that way. But it's that if you don't want to do it yourself, you can call Deer Away, and they'll come and spray your yard every couple of weeks. Anything else?
Okay, how about a climbing rose? Would you cut climbers all the way down? For instance, it's now very old and only 2 main big branches with offshoots.
The question is, would I cut a climbing rose? In that case, if you have the rose growing on like a trellis, I wouldn't cut it down to the ground. I was, the roses I'm talking about are like those old-fashioned roses that need some kind of support, but you can cut them down every year. If it's an actual climber that doesn't have very strong canes that will support itself, then I wouldn't cut it down to the ground every year. I would just cut the dead stuff off and go from there. I will also add that there are certain types of rose varieties. A lot of them are called knockout. That's one of the newer cultivars. They're more of a shrub type rose. I think one of their cultivars is the multiflower rose, which is one of our nice invasive weeds that we have here in New Jersey. But the beauty of the knockouts is that apparently they are resistant to a lot of the diseases that the standard roses get. So that's something to think about it. But it's also a different look. You're not going to get the rose that's growing straight up that has the nice big flowers, the multi-petals. The knockout roses tend to be like a 5-petal variety rose. And they're more of a shrub type, not a climber or a tall one.
Any thoughts about the butterfly bush? I have one that grew like crazy every year for 5 years, always cut back a lot, now not sending much new growth.
Butterfly bush it's considered a bit invasive. It's a bit of a weed. It does grow very quickly, so you can let it grow very big, or you can cut it back to the ground and it should resprout. But if you are having an issue where it's not coming back, I mean, it is possible. Plants do die based on, conditions, or if it's, maybe too wet, or maybe it's not sunny enough. They like to have full sun. So if it isn't coming back, they're really, they're fairly inexpensive. I would say if yours isn't coming back, you might want to replace it with one of the newer varieties. They have some dwarf varieties of butterfly bush that don't get so large. That might be a better fit for your yard, depending on how big you want it to get.
Okay, I think we have one more, sort of a more general question. My cornus Florida white flowers turn brownish suddenly. The leaves stayed green. Is that serious? Do they need more water?
I'm going to say the reason why that, I guess you're in the Scotch Plains area. We had a very late frost. We had a frost in May, which in my life, I don't think we've ever had. The problem is it was right after the dogwoods flowered, and my dogwood in the front did the same thing. The dogwood bloomed, we had the frost, and what happened is the frost didn't kill, but it discolored the bracts on the dogwood. It also got some of the azaleas, and it got some of the tender foliage that was coming out. Some of the leaves were a little bit deformed because of that late frost. So I don't think there's anything wrong with your dogwood. I think it was frost damage from that. I guess it was May, it was probably like the 8th, I think, is when we had that.
Okay, one final comment. My knockout rose bush is 6 feet tall. I'm not sure if that's a question or a...
Well, your knockout rose is 6 feet tall. I mean, but it's more of a shrub. It's not a straight climber. The knockout, that's probably topping out for a knockout. I don't think they get much bigger than 6 feet. That is unusual, though. The knockouts are more shrubby type, not tall type, in my experience.
Would you trim it?
I wouldn't trim it if it's doing what you want it to do for you. If you like the size and it's in an area that it has room to grow, why cut it if it looks good? Like I said, to prune things, you want to prune things for health, aesthetics, or safety. So if it has the room, you don't have to cut it. But if you think it's too big for where it is, then sure, cut it back.
Okay. I think I'll just read its
Thank
final
you very much.
comment. Thank you. This was awesome and helpful. I think that really sums up what Rich, and it is Rich, Mark he's using my son's laptop.
Yeah, it's my son's
laptop.
his laptop.
It has been Rich Miller who just did this fantastic presentation. So thank you again very much. Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Again, I will send a link out with this recording so that you can review it for a while if you'd like. All right, so thanks everybody. Stay safe and have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks.